Good morning. Welcome back to today's Daily Word. I'm Jeremiah. We're going to be in Mark 6 again. In particular, I want to look at Mark 6 verses 45 to 52 with you. And we're going to break this story up into three parts: the sending, the seeking, and the saving. Three parts just to help you grasp the overview of the story. Well, let's start with the sending in verse 45. It says, immediately Jesus sends them away. He sends the disciples away. Now, he has just fed the 5,000. And you might say, well, why send the disciples away immediately? Well, the idea, and John 6 tells us, that after Jesus fed them, the crowd wanted to forcibly make him king. There was this massive messianic fervor, and they were all caught up in it. And so they said, let's just usher in the kingdom now. Let's make Jesus king. Well, he was having none of that because that wasn't God's plan. So it seems likely that he sent the disciples away so they wouldn't get swept up in that fervor, and then he stayed behind to send the crowds away. After he sends the crowds away, the text records that Jesus goes up on the mountain to pray. Now you may wonder, what was he praying about? Story doesn't tell us, but it's pretty likely that when he was up there on that mountain praying alone, he was, at least for some of it, interceding for the disciples. He knew what was coming. He knew the trial they were about to have, and he knew that God would need to fortify their faith. So likely he's praying for them. Well, as he's praying, the disciples are rowing. They are rowing across the lake. It's about a 4-mile journey, and so they're busy rowing. But verse 47 gives us a little bit of a surprise. According to verse 47, it's still evening, which means it's probably very, very dark, about the middle of the night, and they're still rowing. They haven't reached their destination. John says, John 6, the reason is because they had a strong opposing wind. So they're being opposed by the wind, they're rowing hard and not making much headway. It's dark, they're exhausted, and it's getting dangerous for them. Well, verse 48 says they're straining at the oars, and Jesus sees them. It's the fourth watch of the night. The fourth watch means it's about between 3 and 6 a.m. in the morning. So it's probably pitch black. They're exhausted. They've been at it for hours, making very little headway, and it's beginning to get very dangerous for these guys. It's not a good situation for them. Well, that brings us to the second part of the story, from the sending to the seeking, because here is where Jesus comes after them. Jesus knows what's happening with the disciples. He's omniscient. He knows everything. And so he begins to pursue them, and he starts walking across the lake. Obviously, that's a miracle. Nobody can walk on water unless you happen to be God. So Jesus walks on water, and he begins to really overtake them. Now, the verse says he was going to pass them by, which really has the idea of coming alongside. Not that he was going to skirt way around them so they never saw him. He was going to come right alongside them so they would definitely see him, and so that they would likely invite him into the boat. Well, here's what's happened. Here's what happens. Verse 49, they see him and they think it's a ghost. So they're terrified. It says they cry out, which has the idea of screaming in terror. Then, according to verse 50, they were terrified or troubled, which means they were in an absolute panic. The darkness, the conditions, seeing him, thinking it was a ghost, they were almost out of their minds with fear. Well, how does Jesus respond to their fear? His response introduces us to this final section, the saving. Jesus tells them to take heart and not be afraid. And now that phrase, take heart, appears 8 times in the New Testament. Jesus is the only one who ever says it. And that's because Jesus is the only one who can give the peace and the comfort his people need. So Jesus tells them, take heart, Don't be afraid. Well, how do they respond? What happens next? Verse 51 tells us. Jesus gets into the boat, the wind and the waves stop, and everything calms down. And here's the lesson. I think the lesson is buried there. When you're God's child, and when you're where you're supposed to be, no matter how dark and dangerous the situation, there's nothing to fear. Even when there's everything to fear, there's nothing to fear because Jesus, the Son of God, is always the protector of his people.